And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. After every 2 general elections, a 3-person independent and nonpartisan electoral boundaries commission is established. The commission proposes changes to the area, boundaries, and names of British Columbia's provincial electoral districts. On today's Open Connection, Executive Director of Terrace Chamber of Commerce, Michelle Taylor, and MLA Skeena, Ellis Ross.
I am the Executive Director of the Terrace and District Chamber of Commerce. I've been in that role for 5 years now. And we, of course, are a member-based organization representing close to 300 members that are from industry, small mom and pop shops, small business, nonprofits, home-based business, so a real gamut of what represents our community.
And you're from Terrace? You're from Skeena?
I actually grew up here and left after I graduated and went and saw different parts of British Columbia and found my way back in 2007 and came for family reasons because I have a beautiful niece and nephew and yeah, I'm loving being back here. It's just a beautiful part of the world.
So your heart and soul is with Terrace?
Yes.
And Skeena for I gotta say Skeena because I'm the MLA for Skeena.
Absolutely.
Electoral Boundaries Commission. This is, not many people know what this actually is, but it's coming up this year. Mm-hmm. And I just want everybody to know that this is actually legislation. Yes. It comes up every second election. Mm-hmm. And then they rework the boundaries basically based on population and a number of different other factors. But really what's concerning this time around is that the protection for rural communities in terms of representation has been taken away. And this has been quite concerning for all those people that understand the governance structure, yes, that understand representation, and to a large extent understand democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I understand that you've actually you've taken a keen interest in what's happening here in terms of the Electoral Boundaries Commission coming to Terrace and Skeena.
Yes. Collectively, as the Northern BC Chambers, this is on our radar because it's quite concerning to us to think that there is the potential for the North to go from 9 MLAs to perhaps 6 or less. Because of, as you mentioned, it's based on population, and typically there's 25 to 30% either above or below, which is the provincial average, which I understand to be 57,000 people. So when you look at the land area that even for yourself that you represent, I think from our notes we have, you know, the square kilometers you represent is 31,600. You represent over 30,000 people in the Skeena region. However, we have MLAs in the north that have a territory that's 195 square kilometers. How on earth does one MLA represent all of the issues that are affecting his or her constituents in the time that's allowed them in a day of business?
Oh, without a doubt. And you know, I'm an MLA since 2017. And for those listening and watching at home, an MLA actually stands for Member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. This is not federal. This has got nothing to do with your Member of Parliament who actually works in Ottawa. It's got nothing to do with national issues. It's got to do with who represents you in Victoria. That's basically what an MLA does. And in 2017, I understood Skeena very well. Especially when we were talking about Terrace, Kitimat, and all the surrounding communities from Prince Rupert, Haida Gwaii, and Niska. But I didn't understand the representation in Victoria. I had a huge learning curve. And I remember you helping me trying to understand the issues of Terrace in relation to what was happening in Victoria. And so when we're talking about this, I think that the real issue is representation in terms of what Terrace wants to see out of Victoria. And I know it's become quite controversial here, especially now with what's happening in Terrace in terms of crime, for example, in terms of the businesses that have actually closed down or are actually looking to close down, whether because of COVID, because of crime. There's a lot of issues in Terrace that actually Terraceites want to see represented in Victoria. And that's basically what an MLA does. And that's what I've been trying to do.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. The 2015 Electoral Boundaries Commission report proposed increasing the BC electoral districts to 87 from 85, with new ridings in Surrey and Richmond to reflect a growing population in these areas. Let us return to the conversation with Michelle Taylor.
Down in Surrey, one of the fastest growing communities in Canada, BC, they may have, and don't quote me on this because I forgot to look it up, but there's 6 MLAs. So those 6 MLAs are dealing with issues in the city of Surrey. So they're probably very like issues. And so then there's 6 that are going to Victoria representing the city of Surrey. If you take a look at some of these larger ridings, not only in the north, but in our other rural parts of the province, now all of a sudden, like you say, the issues that are happening in Kitimat are very different than the issues that are happening in Terrace. They don't necessarily have the problems that we find in our 3x5 block downtown. And those are such complex issues. So now all of a sudden, if you're now dealing with Kitimat and Prince or Terrace, and then you're looking at the coast and now to Haida Gwaii, how on earth are you going to be able to represent each of us individually with our own problems that we are facing in our communities?
It's definitely one of the hardest obstacles I had to overcome. Because I understood economic development, just basically on my past experience with the Haida Nation Council. I understood LNG, I understood forestry, I understood mining. But what I didn't understand was the municipalities, their cost structure, for example, their tax structure, their infrastructure needs. And then that took me a year at least to get a handle on that and understand how to talk to that and how to represent that in Victoria. And now an MLA, if you don't have that grounding in terms of a municipality's needs, as well as First Nations needs, in a place like Skeena or North Coast, or up in a place like Stikine, then you're going to have a really tough time trying to figure out, how to represent or when to represent it, as opposed to, say, what's happening here in Skeena right now. We've got a pretty good handle on where Terrace is heading and what they want to achieve, where Niska's heading, where Haida's heading, where Kitimat's heading. It's very easy to understand this. It's not easy to get, from, say, where I live, Kitimat, out to the outreaching areas of Skeena, which is Kincolith. Very hard. And even up to places like, and we just found this out, that Stewart is not a part of Skeena. And yet I've been invited up there so many times to look at their issues and understand them. The farthest we reach is actually Gitwan-Silk, which used to be Canyon City, and Alice Arm. But even at the best of times, it's hard to get out there. It's really hard. Like in the wintertime, you're trying to drive up there and trying to talk to people up there. It's really hard, and at times you can't go because of highway conditions. So you can only imagine what it's like for somebody in Kincolith who wants to contact the MLA in Terrace, but the road is closed or it's hazardous, and they don't have any connectivity issues. Yeah. So there's a lot of issues that we're talking about when we're talking about rewriting the boundaries of rural ridings, especially up here in the north.
Well, and if one thing we learned from COVID over the last 2 years is how important connectivity is. We've found ourselves in this virtual world.
What is connectivity, by the way?
Connectivity is the having the infrastructure in place so that those remote locations, not even remote locations, have access to Wi-Fi and the internet, and having the infrastructure in place so that they have cell service. You have, and it's not just about having that infrastructure in place, it's also about having the affordability of it in place. A friend of mine lives in Chetwynd. She lives outside of Chetwynd city limits or town limits, and paying $200 a month for Wi-Fi at home. So is that affordable for all individuals? Not necessarily, especially if they want to be able to reach out to their MLA. And I think the other thing to think about too is the fact that I noticed in our community our ethnic diversity. And that's another thing that needs to be considered, because we have a different ethnic diversity than you may find in Prince Rupert. And that needs to be taken into consideration too.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Siliciums means from the Nass River in the Nisga'a language. Siliciums LNG is a proposed 12 million ton per year liquefied natural gas project. Let us return to the conversation as Ellis shares how Skeena riding is becoming an economic driver for BC.
For the past 5 years, I've heard in the legislature people talking about how diverse BC is with ethnicity, with geography. And the thing of it that we've got to acknowledge here, Skeena has been a huge economic driver for the province. Huge. And then I see there's a lot of benefits that have been actually spreading out to all the surrounding regions as well as BC as a whole. And I just don't see how this fits into the Electoral Boundaries Commission. Economics has got to be a big part of this. I mean, terrorists, without a doubt, knows what it wants to be. They want to change their structure to a point where they're not just a hub anymore. They want to branch out into industrial initiatives. They don't want to be just a government service provider anymore. They don't want to just be retail. So how do you actually represent that when your region is so large that you've got to balance it against, say, what Haida Gwaii wants, for example, or say what Smithers wants, for example, who may not want industrial development in the same, in the same manner of what Terrace wants. So this is huge. The representation is actually, you got to understand your region, you got to understand their needs and their wants, and you got to communicate that to Victoria, whether or not you're opposition or whether or not you're government. And I don't see how they do this. That's fair.
I just feel really at the end of the day, I should, and others should have the ability to be able to access their MLA. And in my example of Surrey, they have access to their MLA. Here in the north, finding that access, whether it's you going to them or trying to be able to connect to you in other means, is just not as easy. And it is something that we should be having a very strong voice when the commission comes to Terrace. The schedule is out, and they are coming on April 27th and will be at the Best Western at 3:30 to make in-person presentations. You do have to go to their website to be able to sign up in advance. There's also an online portal on their website where you can answer a series of questions as to why you think boundaries shouldn't be changed for us in the north.
Got to make it clear, the Electoral Boundaries Commission is an arm of government, basically. They are not partisan. They're not political. They're just following the legislation. But the question is going to come out whether or not this is a BC Liberal thing versus NDP. And what I've read so far, this has got nothing to do with political parties.
This has nothing to do with political parties, Ellis. This it doesn't matter if we take North Coast and the Skeena and the area beside us and Stikine, sorry, yeah, thanks. Stikine, and now all of a sudden it doesn't matter if it's a Liberal who is representing us or it's an NDP MLA that's representing us in this area. It's the fact that whether it's you or Nathan or anybody else, you're not going to be able to see all of your constituents and understand the complex issues that are impacting their lives that you then need to understand to be able to take those concerns down to Victoria and represent us in a meaningful way. So at the end of the day, this isn't about Liberals and NDP, it's just about representing the constituents.
That's a really good point because, you know, MLA stands for Member of the Legislative Assembly. That's what I am. That's what I got elected to do. I wasn't elected as the BC Liberal representative. That is not what it's about. In fact, there's 87 MLAs currently sitting in the BC legislature. Under the Electoral Boundaries Commission initiative, that could be expanded to 93. Mm-hmm. But that means combining a lot of the rural ridings, or a few of the rural ridings, to actually get rid of some of the MLAs in rural ridings, maybe even in the northern regions here as well. But ultimately, it still comes down to representation. Individually, each MLA has to represent their riding. And they've got to do it in a way that actually reflects the values and the objectives of what that riding wants to achieve. I'll give you an example. How does an MLA represent a larger riding and actually reflect the needs? Say, for example, the Niska want to see the Cranberry Connector paved. Well, you've got to champion that. But in a larger riding, you've got so many competing interests there. How do you be fair to Niska as opposed to, say, Terrace as a hub who wants a new hospital? The hospital was the main driving factor behind the politics for Skeena for the last 5 years. And Terrace finally got their hospital. But it was a priority. It was a no-brainer for anybody running for this MLA position to say, yes, Terrace needs that hospital. We got LNG in Kitimat, we got Niska Treaty, but the priority has to be the hospital. So it's going to be harder for an MLA to represent a larger region, you know, and try to balance out which issue should be championed in terms of a priority. I think everybody agrees, everybody's happy with the hospital. That was a huge directive to any politician running this region. And now I think that the next initiative here for Skeena, okay, we need the Cranberry Connector, not only in terms of economic development for Niska, for say their LNG dreams or say their tourism dreams, but we need an alternate route to get out of Skeena in event of emergency.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
In November 2021, high water levels and slides damaged bridges and large road sections in the Lower Mainland. This resulted in cutting off main access routes to several areas in the province. In this final segment of Open Connection, Michelle recalls when a landslide occurred just outside of Terrace.
We saw that in 2007 with the mudslide 18 kilometers east of town. We were cut off for a week.
We saw it in the Coquihalla, just the recent flooding here in the last year.
That's right.
Coquihalla got shut down. Actually, Vancouver was actually isolated just because of all the infrastructure was actually shut down because of flooding and fires.
That's right.
Terrace, Kitimat, we got the same issue. And yet we have an issue coming out of the Cranberry Connector. That's a solution. But we got to prioritize that. It's a lot easier to prioritize that with Skeena in the way it actually currently sits, as opposed to a super riding that could involve anywhere from Smithers to Kitimat to Terrace, all the way out to Haida Gwaii, down towards Rivers Inlet. And at the end of the day, representation has got to be fair. And that's what I look for. Representation's got to be fair, it's got to be democratic, and it's got to be open and transparent.
I have to be perfectly honest, Ellis. I had to do a little bit of research. That's the fun thing about my job is I know a little bit of something about a lot of things, and when you start diving deep into what the legislation says, which is guiding the commission, and the importance of the word effective representation, that is the thing that is the term that we need to focus on and ensure that the community and the region understands what that actually means, so that they can understand that this is really going to impact us, so that they will become a part of the taking the survey, as I mentioned, online, or doing the in-person, so that the commission hears a consistent messaging that this is important to people in the North.
Do you feel that people understand what effective representation means in the context of being an MLA and going to Victoria?
You know what? I have to say that I was talking to a few people this morning, and they're like, not quite sure what that word means. I get what effective and representation means, but what is the definition? And that definition has actually the court's point of view as to what it means, and it entails two things: relative parity of voting power and countervailing factors such as geography, community history, community interests, and minority representation. That was the Supreme Court actually recognized that constituents look to their MLA for two purposes: to promote their interests through legislative processes and to provide assistance in their dealings with the provincial bureaucracy.
This MLA office in Terrace, we're trying to balance so many different issues. The local issues from individuals trying to deal with government programs. And our problem is that we're used for everything. Federal programs, people come into this office for help. Provincial programs, people come to this office. People from actually outside of our region, outside of our riding, come to this office. And we've got to explain to them the whole MLA system. We've got to explain to them the whole riding system and the representation system. And so I find that, even for myself, there's an education that needs to be held. And I try to do this with newspaper articles. I actually do it here with CFTK to kind of shed light on some of the issues. But it all kind of boils down to representation. It does boil down to because I am opposition. I am not the government. My job is to hold government transparent, make sure that they're held accountable for some of the legislation they're passing. And even to some certain extent, the policies and regulations that flow from legislation. That's my job. And I find it really difficult to explain to people, there's so many different levels to this. But I think you put it quite well. Effective representation is what we're really trying to deal with, regardless if I'm here or not. Skeena does need a voice, especially given the time we're in right now, with all the economic development that we're providing for the benefit of British Columbia.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.